I want to talk to you today about the following topic. How do emotionally intelligent leaders and their teams take big bet decisions or don't? So the focus here is on emotion, on leadership, and on big bet decisions. Now, if we think about decision making, we have in our sort of backgrounds the rational person model of decision making. And it's a fairly straightforward one. We say, you know, there are various alternatives and we have criteria for evaluating the alternatives and we choose the optimal solution. But you know and I know that this is quite insufficient. And if you have friends who are wrestling with really big stakes questions, where should I live? What career should I pursue? Should I have children? Whom should I marry? Should I change my course? You know that's not how they make the decision. We say to them, what's in your gut? And Raphael was telling me today, you know, the research on neurology says there are guts in our stomach. There are neurons in our stomach as well as in our brains. What's in your gut? And what we mean by that is there's a subconscious process that's integrating facts and figures and thoughts and feelings. And when we're lucky, it comes up with a feeling of conviction. And it's that conviction that allows us to make a decision. So that's really what decision making is like on big stakes issues. And we need to take that common sense experience and bring it to bear also in thinking about groups, leaders, and businesses. Those should not be two separate worlds. We shouldn't have the rational person model for business and then a common sense and a deep sense of how, as individuals, we make decisions. Now, behavioral economics has made some progress in this regard. It's advanced our thinking. You might be familiar with the concept of regret aversion, which says, if I make a decision and then I think that if the decision goes wrong, I'll regret it so much in the future, that should modify my decision now. That's not bad. It's not a bad emendation to the rational person model of decision making. Interestingly, there was the very famous theorist of optimal portfolio allocation named Harry Markowitz. And he developed the mathematics of allocating your cash between stocks and bonds. But when it came to his own making of a decision, he said to himself, my God, if I put too much money in stocks and the stock market tanks, I'll feel terrible. And if I put too little money in the stock market and the stock market goes up, I'll feel terrible. So I'm going to allocate my money 50-50 between stocks and bonds. So that was his solution, the man who developed the mathematics. When it came to himself, he was working around the feelings of regret. That's a good advance in terms of thinking about emotions and decision making, but the problem with it is that it looks at emotions in the future, and it looks at our conscious processing of those emotions in the future. That's not quite enough. We need a phenomenology of decision making in the present. What is the feeling of the making of the decision in the here and now? We have feelings about it in the moment, anxiety, detachment, excitement, dread, all sorts of feelings going on right now, and they shape the decision process, often at a subconscious level. So we need to go beyond the behavioral economics model. Now, I'm going to talk to you about something that's like bringing coals to Newcastle. Everybody here is familiar with the idea of turbulence. That is, today, the marketplace, as it's envisioned and perceived by executives and decision makers, is very difficult to discern in its structure, in its causal texture. We call that a turbulent environment. And why is that important? Because this highlights and it brings into relief the difficulties of making decisions under these conditions. And what I want to suggest to you is the following. Turbulence creates a certain kind of perspective, a certain kind of framework on perception, which I call ambiguity. Now, ambiguity is different than uncertainty, and that's a very important distinction. If you look on the left-hand side, you see the cone of uncertainty describing where the hurricane will land in New Orleans. That's Hurricane Katrina, which was such a horrible hurricane. And we sort of track approximately when and where it will land. That's uncertainty. But ambiguity is something different. That's the right-hand side. How many of you, in looking at that picture, see the young lady as you look at it? How many of you see the, as they say in the textbooks, the old hag? Right. And how many of you switch back and forth as you look at it? Okay, that's ambiguity. That's the classic optical illusion. The thing about ambiguity is even if we know the facts, we don't know the meaning of the facts. So ambiguity is about meaning. We can't be preoccupied with probabilities because we haven't yet created our own story. Where are we in this? What's our role? Where's the story that we're part of? And some of the work that Raphael does and Norman Partner does, masterful work on scenarios, is all about creating plausible stories. In the context of ambiguity, sometimes more information is confusing. It's overload. We don't know what to do with it. And often in response to ambiguity, instead of exploring options, which would be the rational course, we simply become rigid. So what I want to suggest to you is that turbulence creates ambiguity, and ambiguity has consequences for how we think and decide in the present moment. Ambiguity also has an emotional correlate in what I call dread. What I mean by dread is that situation in which the consequences that you imagine are, threatening consequences are high. There's a lot at stake, but you don't know where the threats will come from. And under those conditions, you feel dread. If you knew where the threats could come from, or might come from, you could be vigilant. And that would be a good stance to take as a leader. Be vigilant with respect to your environment. But if you don't know, you're going to feel more likely dread. There's a story that we tell now about the iPod and iTunes, and we say those two innovations undermined music publishing as a business because it stripped away the song from the CD or from the record, and you now bought individual songs and listened to it on the MP3 player or on the iPod. This has now become a story that's become mythologized, not in the sense that it's not true, but it's become almost like a kind of a telling story about how we are now. This could happen to us, or this might happen to us, or will this happen to us in our company, in our industry. And that's what I call the kind of dread of the current situation. That's what ambiguity and turbulence creates at an emotional level. Now, as the term dread suggests, decision makers can't actually get away from dread. There's a kind of vicious circle. You know, ambiguity creates dread, dread creates a kind of turning away, but the turning away, you need to actively turn away. I call it active procrastination, actively not deciding. It takes time and energy to do nothing. And that's a very important dimension of decision making. And we know from individual research the various strategies people use to not take decisions. And these are active strategies. One is evasion. I look for whatever I can to distract me. How many of you have done that? Raise your hands. Okay. One is buck passing. I look for someone else to make the decision for me. Raise your hands. One is bolstering, which means I look for all sorts of rationalizations for why is not the right time now to make decisions. Raise your hands. And finally, attenuation, which is very common in organizations, and I'll get back to that. And that is you hedge in the decision with a sufficient number of compromises that it really doesn't reflect a new direction. You basically compromise the decision. And then you wonder why nothing changes or why you can't execute. These are active strategies. These are the methods for doing nothing. A very famous procrastinator in English literature is, of course, yours truly, Hamlet. And if you recall, he had an experience of dread because he encountered a ghost in the beginning of the play, if you remember. And the ghost says to him, I am the ghost of your father, and I was killed by your uncle who is now the king. You must avenge me. Well, what could be clearer than that? But actually, what is a ghost? How do you interpret a ghost? And Hamlet doesn't really know. It's a signal that's not clear. It could be, as Hamlet says to himself, maybe the ghost is from the devil, is a form of the devil. And if I follow the devil's advice and I kill my uncle, I am a murderer, and I can't possibly do that. I'm an ethical man. He comes up with a strategy, but let's think about if it really is a strategy. If you remember, he says, I know, I'm going to stage a play within this play, so to speak. I'm going to stage a play in which somebody kills a king. And I'm going to watch my uncle and see how he responds. And if he responds in a distressed way, that'll be a signal. As he says, the play's the thing to uncover the conscience of the king. Well, his uncle does respond in a distressed way upon watching the play, but actually, what does that mean? How do you interpret that signal? After all, if you're a king and you're watching a play about a king being murdered, wouldn't you be distressed? He erected a test which has no definitive qualities to it. And then what happens? He sees his uncle praying at the chapel wall. He faces his back to Hamlet. Hamlet has a chance to kill him, and Hamlet says, wait a minute, if I kill him, his soul might go to heaven, and in which case, that won't be good because I want his soul to go to hell. So he doesn't kill him. Well, we can recognize that as a form of bolstering, right? A form of rationalization. Because after all, the test that he took, that play, was not a real test. Hamlet is the classic active procrastinator. Now, we can say Hamlet rationalized his indecision. I can't act now. I can't kill my uncle right now. What that also means is that he fooled himself. And I want to ask you a question. How can someone fool themselves? How can you be both the deceiver and the deceived? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? Yet how many of you in your natural language and conversation have said to a friend, you're fooling yourself? Raise your hands if you've ever said that to somebody. So we know in our common sense experience that goes on all the time. In psychoanalysis, what we say is that there's a truth which is too difficult to bear, and we repress that into the unconscious mind. That's where the truth resides. And then we construct a story to protect ourselves from that truth. That's in the conscious mind. So that's how you can be both the deceiver and the deceived at the same time. The mind itself is divided. Now, I'm talking a lot about individuals here. How can groups fool themselves? Because groups don't have unconscious minds, right? Though groups don't have minds. We might speak metaphorically of a group mind, but how do they fool themselves? I want to talk to you about rituals. And I'm going to propose to you that ritualization is a form through which groups fool themselves. Take, for example, the standard advice for good teamwork. Usually it goes something like this. Don't interrupt each other. Don't judge one another's contributions. Everybody should take turns. Everybody's opinion is valued. Now, how many of you have had that kind of conversation when you're amongst friends and you're talking about something you really care about? I suspect many of you interrupt each other a lot, right? You don't take turns, you judge each other's contributions. You don't follow these rules. It's not natural. It's not the way conversation unfolds in reality. So what's the purpose of these rules? Why do they exist? Well, one very simple hypothesis is that the purpose of these rules is to contain the anxiety associated with talking about a big stakes issue. Anxiety minimization becomes the latent goal, and the rules serve that purpose. Now you might ask yourself, doesn't everybody know that? Well, what happens is something funny. Because people's anxiety is contained, they feel relatively good. And because they feel good, they say, well, this is a good decision process. It's legitimate. It feels right. And because they say that, they then vest the process with authority. So we have a group dynamic That's a form through which people with groups can actually fool themselves. What they do, and this is a very important term, is that the groups act as if they are working, in quotes, as if. And as if behavior is how groups demonstrate that same kind of unconscious processing that individuals display. Rituals can take different forms. Now I'm talking about those rituals that have this kind of psychodynamic character of allowing groups to fool themselves. When Lou Gerstner took over IBM in the early 90s, he discovered that the management committee, which was at the apex of the corporation, did not do any real work. And yet, everybody in the company, their goal, if you were an executive, was to join the management committee. And what he found was that, in fact, there was a powerful staff organization that would organize the requests for money for capital allocation behind the scenes and work out all the compromises necessary among the different divisional executives, and then bring it to the executive management committee for basically what he called rubber stamp approval. So what was this management committee? Why did everybody want to get on it? You have to say that it's kind of mythologized in a way. The management committee became its own appearance. That's what it was. It was its appearance. I have the picture here of the Queen presenting, the speech from the throne to the Parliament. And of course, we know consciously that that's a ritual, and we understand. So that's not the same thing that I'm talking about in the case of Lou Gerstner's management committee. But it's a similar idea, how a ritualized process is drained of meaning. And that's a very important group dynamic. And of course, one function of this ritualized process was that it suppressed contention and debate at the very top of the corporation. Well, what does an emotionally intelligent leader do who wants to help a group make a big bet decision in the face of these kinds of dynamics that I've described to you? The dynamics of active procrastination, of decision avoidance, of ritualization of talk. What does the emotionally intelligent leader do? I'm going to give you a kind of sneak peek into this, and I want to come back to this. But in the psychoanalysis of organizations, we speak of the leader as the container. And what we mean by that is a leader who can set the table and the context in which emotions linked to ideas can be safely expressed and passionately engaged with. That's the container. And of course, containment means also to delimit some of the destructive impacts that might ensue when people are so passionately engaged. It's the opposite of controlling, suppressing, avoiding, or smoothing over conflict. So that's what we want to get in this talk, to think about the characteristics that make for the containing leader, because that's going to be essential for big bet decisions. All right, let me make a shift here, because I've talked to you about the impediments to big bet decisions. Are you on sort of with me on this so far? Yep. Okay. If we want to understand how to help groups make big bet decisions, we need a model of big bet decisions. What are they? How would you know if you saw one? What does it look like? What are its characteristics? I want to make a hypothesis, a proposal to you about this, that they have three distinguishing features. One, there's a sense of immediacy. People act with a sense of urgency. It's the here and now and it counts. That goes against the avoidance syndrome and the procrastination. Second, the strategy that develops to implement or to characterize the big bet decision is ultimately simple. It can be characterized simply. Because if it can't be characterized simply, there's a good chance that it represents a range of compromises that attenuate the decision and vitiate execution. And thirdly, it has the quality of necessity. Once you light upon it, you say to yourself, we can't not do this. This is obvious that we should do this. Why didn't we think of that before? Often in business, it has the quality of, Everybody wins if we do this. So what I want to suggest to you is it has these three qualities: immediacy, simplicity, and necessity. So the question for us becomes, how does the containing leader get a group into that space, right, where they can make that kind of decision? Let me again give you an example of Lou Gerstner, who turned around IBM. When he came to the company, he saw that the executives were planning to break up IBM. How many of you are familiar with that story? Have you read about that? Okay, they were planning to break up IBM. And there was a narrative in the industry at the time, you might call it the scenario in use at the time, that said competition will be amongst competitors that specialize in different aspects of the computer industry. Hardware, software, PCs, mainframes, servers, storage, those will all be separate companies, and IBM needs to break itself up to accomplish that. That's the narrative he faced, and that's the situation he faced when he came in. What did he do? Well, first he met with customers. One of his first big meetings was with 100 customers and very few IBM staff. And they said to him, wait a minute, we need help integrating all these devices. We can't do it ourselves. We need a method for making this all work together. We need your mainframe computer at the center of our ecology of IT devices. It's an ecology. We don't know how to work it. We don't know how to work with it. And of course, Gerstner had some ideas about this because he had been a customer of IBM when he was the CEO of American Express. So he had lived in the customer's feet. In the shoes, I should say. Can't live in the feet, but you can live in the shoes. What did he do? He threw out the consultants, the advertising folks, the bankers who were all planning the breakup. And he said, we're focusing on integration support. That was his first step. Second step, he said, you know what? The price of the IBM 390 mainframe is too high. It's basically, we're treating it like a cash cow, and it's financing the breakup. And I'm not going to let that happen. So we're cutting the price of the IBM mainframe substantially. Well, that created a crisis, right? Because now they had to really cut expenses significantly, and in addition, they had to sell a lot more mainframes around the value proposition that Gerstner was advancing, which was integration. And thirdly, he got rid of that management committee. And he put in a much more deliberative body that was really policy-oriented, and he said, this is a committee where no executive, divisional executive, is ever going to present PowerPoints to. I know I'm presenting a PowerPoint, but Gerstner said, not in my committee. We're not going to do that. So those are the steps he took, and what were the consequences? Quite extraordinary. Mainframe sales grew 12 times over 8 years, while the price of a unit of mainframe processing fell 96%. It was an extraordinary turnaround. And he says, reports in his book, he says, this represented a staggering turnaround. While pricing was not the only reason IBM survived, this would not have happened had we had not made this risky bet. So what I want to suggest to you is Gerstner embodies the features of the decision process that I'm characterizing as big bet decisions. Simple. Basically, you know, we're going to be the best integrators on the street. You couldn't state it more simply. Immediacy. By the way, I've got the price. We have big problems in front of us. You got to start to sell, and you got to cut expenses. There was real urgency now. And necessary. It had the force of, it had the kind of the freedom of no choice. We have to do this once we set along this path. The trajectory is made for us. Now you'll say to me, oh, that's a great story, Larry, but by the way, weren't you talking about ambiguity? And after all, isn't one of the definitions of ambiguity that you don't know if there's a crisis, right? Isn't that the hallmark of ambiguity? So we don't know the meaning of the situation. That's a puzzle. How can we use this model in the presence of ambiguity? And you can't always burn your bridges behind you, right? So you leave no return path. You can't always do that. What does the emotionally intelligent leader do under these circumstances to facilitate big bet decision making? What I want to suggest to you, and I'm going to go through several steps here, is first, when it comes to immediacy, the substitute for the crisis is passion. A passionately held idea is an amplification of a weak signal from the future. Let me give you the story of a colonel named John Warden. He was a major person in developing Air Force use of air power doctrine in the Gulf War. And he said for a long time, before the Gulf War, he said, you know, our doctrine comes from World War II, where the presenting question was, how many planes do you need to take out a single target? But with precision bombing today, the presenting question is, how many targets can a single plane take out? Very simple flip, in a way. And often good strategists are able to crystallize their thinking in those simple kind of switches. He was asking for doctrine to be changed, and what do you think happened? He was a pain in the neck as an advocate. He burned brightly with his ideas. A tactical Air Force command hated his ideas because he lost no opportunity to advocate for them. And he rarely listened to those people who dissented from him. And he got the assignment to develop the plan for the Gulf War by accident. It's a true story. When I read about it, it was amazing. It turned out that when the general called the chief of staff was on vacation, and he wouldn't have given this work to Warden, but somebody else did. We can't allow good ideas to get lost in that way. But also, you see, if he's not passionate about the idea and it contradicts Air Force doctrine, if he's polite and nice and good, what will happen? He won't get a hearing, right? If he doesn't take personal risks and demonstrate his own skin in the game, because he's asking, after all, others to contravene Air Force doctrine, why should they listen to him? So you can't have one without the other. It's like love and marriage. You can't have passion without the intrusive, pain-in-the-neck person. The two have to go together. But passion's not enough. As we saw in this case, he might have been overlooked had it not been for the accident. It's the fuel, not the fire. What does the emotionally intelligent leader do to integrate passion into deliberations? That's the presenting question. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Okay. How can the emotionally intelligent leader help the groups take up ideas enlivened by passion? There's two challenges here. One is groups can kill any idea with analysis and due diligence. How many of you have been at committees where that's happened? There's no idea that bears total scrutiny, right? It has to be the case. And there have been many famous people, people who've made these predictions about why certain technologies would never fly, right? Daryl Zanuck, who was a famous studio executive and film producer, talking about the coming of television, he said, television won't be able to hold on to any market it captures after the first 6 months. People will soon get tired of staring at a plywood box every night. There's no idea that can withstand scrutiny, analytic scrutiny. But the other side, of course, is fads, to be swept up by a fad, right? That's literally the other side of the coin. Both of them represent a degree of thoughtlessness. One is overthinking and one is underthinking. But they're both inadequate to the task of actually thinking realistically and also imaginatively. When Gerald Levin merged his Time Warner company with AOL, unfortunately, as business history shows, that was one of the biggest merger disasters in history. He was swept up by the dot-com mania and made the mistake of thinking that AOL was the internet. Of course, course, it was not. But that was really what happens when you're subjected to fads. How does the emotionally intelligent leader manage between these two poles? What's the work? What's the texture of the work to move between these two poles and to still bring the emotion into the decision making? What I want to suggest is that there's a kind of a balance between passion, scrutiny, and creativity. And the emotionally intelligent leader allows a group to sort of exist at the midpoint of these 3 points. Passion creates the vision, scrutiny articulates the barriers, creativity proposes how to overcome them. Well, that's kind of a statement of the work of the emotionally intelligent leader in the making of big bet decisions. What about the creativity part, though? How do you do that? That's easy to say, be creative. It's like saying to somebody, be spontaneous. I think here, and I'm getting coals to Newcastle, I think reframing does the job. This is Richard Norman's great contribution. I think reframing is the form of creativity in business thinking processes. It's how business groups are creative in thinking about their markets and their offerings. How many of you are familiar with the phrase reframing? Some of you? Okay, and you might know it just as an English language term, but I'll talk a little bit about it. I'll give some examples of it. It's a creative act. It changes the boundaries of what seems natural, and it creates excitement by disclosing a potentially new reality. And the excitement displaces the anxiety and reinforces the creative thinking. Now, the most famous example of reframing that I can think of is the work that Bill Walton of Walmart did. He had a very simple idea. What did he say? He said, look, there's a general store and it's small, and it's because it's in a small town, but do general stores have to be small just because they're in small towns? What if I placed the general store at the crossroads of small towns? And he had an insight. He had kind of his own scenario in the mind where he saw the federal highway system in the United States creating all these crossroads. He actually became a helicopter pilot, and he would survey the territory in the southeast looking for the crossroads. Build big stores at the crossroads of small towns. You couldn't have a simpler business idea. That's a reframing, right? You take what's natural and you turn it upside down. And again, often it has that kind of paradoxical quality. And this shaped the elements of his business model very clearly. If it was going to be a general store, it had to provide for one-stop shopping. If it was going to serve a region, the warehouse had to be inside the store. Are there Walmarts in the UK? Yeah, okay. And it had to be family friendly, which meant the prices had to be low. So it sort of unfolded itself as an idea. Let me give you another example of reframing, and this will get back to this question of passion and groups. This comes from a writer named Gerald Kendall in a book he called Viable Vision. He describes a supplier of communications equipment where the corporate customers buy repetitively. The supplier is doing reasonably well, 90% availability of the parts, but the buyers, they're being driven crazy by their own users. The users are project managers who are in charge of various construction or installation projects, and they need these communications equipment. What happens? Like in all project management, the project managers have to change their mind at the last minute because their clients change their mind at the last minute, and the buyer is frantically looking for parts and can't find it. The project is delayed, which is very costly, and when the buyer finds the part, he has to pay high priority shipping costs. Now that's a pain point for a customer, right? That's a pain point. What to do, how to respond to this pain point. Of course, you know in business, understanding the pain point is the first step in configuring the offering. That's a fundamental aspect of business logic. Well, a very simple solution. Again, I think simplicity is always the best measure of the acuteness of a strategy, of a design. And what it is you simply give your customers their commonly ordered items on consignment. Let them have it. Let them have it in their own warehouse. You'll only trigger the purchase order when they actually take the item and use it. And to show the buyer that you have a certain commitment to this offering, you're going to say, if you ever get to a stock out where you can't get the parts, we're going to take the loss of profit on that item. That's a beautiful solution because the customers get 0 lead time. The part's right there. There are no project delays, no carrying costs for the customer, no priority shipping costs. The supplier gets more business because they've addressed a pain point, and more importantly, because their equipment is now in the buyer's warehouse, they can lock in the customer more, right? And more likely the customer is not going to leave them for somebody else because they have all their equipment. What could be wrong with this, right? It has the force of necessity, doesn't it? It's sort of like, God, everybody wins, we should do this. You see what I mean by necessity in this regard? Well, would this go easy over well in a company? What do you think? As compelling as it may be, you can think of all the problems, right? All the risks, and of course there have to be risks because this is a strategy and it's a kind of big bet. It's changing fundamentally how you're relating to your buyers, to your customers. There is risk. For example, and reasonably so, the supplier would worry, my margins will slip because, the items that are shipped on consignment may be too slow moving. A lot of working capital in those items. There's shrinkage. I don't own the facility, so maybe somebody's going to pilfer some stuff or it'll get lost, right? There's slow pay. Why should the customer pay me right away when they have the item already, right? They don't need to pay me to get it. So there's kind of risks, right? People will raise these as objections and as obstacles. And in any case, the company's doing okay. It's not doing badly. Why take this risk? Why go this big bet course? And actually, to really make this work, you would have to build a replenishment system, inventory replenishment system that worked pretty perfectly. Well, there is no way, given these constraints, that this decision will be taken unless 2 conditions are in place. Oh, now let me say one more thing. This kind of replenishment system, consignment system challenges policies too, because it cuts across logistics, procurement, and finance. And policies represent the authorities of different divisions, and each division wants to protect its own authority. So that's an added burden to this kind of thing. There'd be strong tendency to stay the same. What does the emotionally intelligent leader do to advance a decision? First of all, you'll need passionate individuals. No way out. You'll need somebody who's willing to take a risk to their standing and reputation to advance this and to also represent and say they'll execute it. And second of all, you need an executive or an executive group that can sponsor the deliberation around this big bet decision in a way that provokes all the conflict and the obstacles and the passions surrounding it. That's for sure. Otherwise, this doesn't get implemented. Well, what kind of emotionally intelligent leader can do this? Remember I talked about the container? How do you do this? How do you get the groups to be integrating the scrutiny, the creativity, to produce this sort of result, and to do this in the context of emotions that are stirred up because the risks are large? I want to talk to you about a particular person that I think embodies what I call this kind of emotional intelligence. He was Alan Layton, and he was the CEO of Asda, the UK grocery chain, which in the late 80s, early 90s was in great crisis.
This is now part of Walmart.
Okay, yes, it's interesting, yeah. So it was in tremendous crisis. And Archie and Layton, Norman and Layton kind of built a store renewal program bypassing the chain of command, and they really revivified the business. A very, very important turnaround. Now Layton formed a group which he called the Shittin. believe it or not, that was the term. And it stood clumsily for Store Heads Office Interactive Trading Meeting. Okay, he made that up, right? He really wanted to call it the shit'em, because this was going to be the place where the shit would fly, right? And what did he do? He had the traders, the buyers, and the regional store managers go at each other. And he put a table in the middle and said, this is a plank. And if you regional store managers want to attack a trader, you can put him on the desk, and you're going to throw a criticism at him. And if he can't answer it, he has to take one more step toward the edge of the desk. He has to walk the plank. And there was, as he described it, it's a very, very emotion-filled meeting. But this is what he says about it. Everyone hated it, but it was fantastic, because we put all the issues on the table. And it got to be the case in the lingo of the company when people were dealing with difficult issues and difficult people, they would say, we got to get that person to walk the plank. So it became part of the kind of conversation of the firm. What's his emotional intelligence? It's very specific. When we talk about emotional intelligence, it's kind of a fuzzy term. I want to suggest to you that it's very specific features that are linked to this question of big bet decisions. First, you're able to bring an element of play into conflict. That's the plank. Second, you can provoke people so that they say things that they are reluctant to say. Fourth, and I'll come to the third in a second, you're comfortable with emotional extremes. And the other piece is, I heard him talk at the Harvard Business School about this case, which had been written up by the Harvard Business School professors, and it was called Breaking the Code of Change. And he said at the end of his talk, he said, it's the bit that nobody understands. It's very difficult to teach. It's all in the people. It's absolutely all in the people, to teach people how to do things and for them willingly and well. It's ordinary people. And that's the code to crack. That's what he said to the pointy-headed academics at the Harvard Business School. He was sort of saying, you don't get it. I understand what it means to connect to people. So he had that capacity, and that's the fourth dimension of emotional intelligence, to connect to ordinary people. Now, why is this so fundamental to the act of reframing and creativity, and to the tumult that it requires, to the scrutiny and to the creativity, and to the passion that's all part of this decision process? Playfulness is very important because it connects people to each other even when they're in conflict. If you look at married couples, those couples that can play while they're fighting have a long marriage ahead of them. It's a very important feature, playfulness. Provocation is getting the words out of people, right? You have to push them a bit. The common touch, that allows everybody to sustain some level of self-esteem and self-respect, because these sorts of deliberations can be psychologically injurious. And finally, tolerating emotional extremes, because that brings into sharp relief the risks and the stakes. For me, then, this is what we want out of our leaders if we expect them to facilitate big bet decision making. These four characteristics. So let me end over there and close this thing. Let me get this out of your way. And you're looking at extra slides behind the scenes. Time for some questions, reflections.
Thank you very much, Lou.
Sure.
It really